Absolutely. You have a feeling that, wait a minute, I'm so off base here that I got to go back and do what I really understand.
For over 5 decades, one Columbo episode has never seen the light of day. Not because it was lost, unfinished, or forgotten, but because it scared the network. Tucked away in a vault, locked under silence, it broke every rule the series was built on. This wasn't just another case of a clever slayer and a crumpled raincoat. It was something stranger, sharper. A story so unsettling, it made executives sweat and vanish it before cameras could roll. Who wrote it? Why was it buried? And what was so different about this script that NBC pulled the plug before it ever aired? Today, we're peeling back the layers of a forgotten television gamble, a creative collision that almost rewired Columbo forever. The clues are here. The crime was never broadcast. The director involved, Brian De Palma, was never meant to write for television, and certainly not for a show like Columbo. By the early 1970s, he had carved out a niche in cinema with deeply psychological, often provocative thrillers like Greetings and Sisters, films that reveled in voyeurism, identity, and manipulation. He was drawn to Hitchcockian tension, but pushed it into darker, more experimental territory. To De Palma, TV was too safe, too formulaic. So when he unexpectedly agreed to write a Columbo episode during a writer's strike in 1973, it wasn't out of love for the format. It was an opportunity to smuggle in a radical idea under the cover of a detective show. His episode, centered on a narcissistic filmmaker named Quentin Lee, was less a mystery than a philosophical statement. Lee wasn't driven by money or revenge, but by a twisted artistic challenge. To commit a homicide purely as a creative act. It wasn't about getting away with it. It was about filming it, making the act of homicide a part of a larger, self-referential film project. Through this lens, De Palma turned Columbo's traditional question, how will he catch the slayer, into what is the meaning of the crime itself. It was a move that deliberately blurred the line between narrative and commentary, between spectacle and morality. De Palma's script subverted the core of Columbo's appeal, its moral clarity. In typical episodes, viewers watched as the detective unpicked the smug overconfidence of rich slayers who believed they were too clever to be caught. But in this version, the slayer had no illusions about guilt or innocence. He believed in nothing but his own authorship. That made Columbo's role unclear. He wasn't exposing a moral flaw or breaking down a psychological mask. He was just an unwitting participant in someone else's cinematic performance. The detective became, effectively, part of the set dressing, a powerless observer in a story designed to have no catharsis. What De Palma created wasn't just an edgy episode, it was a creative manifesto disguised as network TV. The script read more like something from a graduate film seminar than a crime of the week show. It challenged not only Columbo's formula, but also his assumptions of television storytelling itself. In this way, it was a creative outlier that stood in open defiance of the show's structure, pace, and tone. For NBC, the risk was too great. But for De Palma, it was a calculated attempt to inject his auteurist worldview into the least likely vehicle. And that may be why the episode was buried for 5 decades. De Palma's vision didn't just shake up the show's identity, it rattled something deeper at NBC, triggering a quiet panic that had nothing to do with plot and everything to do with control. Why the network pulled the plug. When NBC executives first read the proposed Columbo script by Brian De Palma, their reaction wasn't just concern, it was alarm. The network had built its primetime lineup around shows that were not only entertaining, but safe. Columbo, despite its unconventional how cacum format, still operated within a clear moral framework. The slayer had a motive, the detective exposed it, and justice prevailed. De Palma's script shattered that rhythm. The slayer had no motive, just a cold, intellectual curiosity about slaying. It introduced a layer of nihilism and artistic detachment that executives believed would alienate the audience, particularly on a Sunday night when families gathered around the television. NBC's decision to shelve the episode wasn't a straightforward act of censorship, it was an act of brand management. In the 1970s, network television operated with tight constraints. Programming needed to appeal to a broad audience, offend no one, and avoid psychological ambiguity. A story centered on a motiveless slaying, framed as a filmmaking experiment, didn't just stretch the boundaries, it obliterated them. Executives feared it would confuse viewers, spark controversy, or worse, create a backlash that could damage the network's carefully cultivated reputation for respectable, mainstream programming. What made De Palma's vision especially dangerous to NBC was its refusal to offer emotional closure. Traditional Columbo episodes gave viewers a sense of balance being restored. The bad guy was exposed, and the world made sense again. This episode provided no such comfort. The Slayer's detached demeanor, his philosophical rejection of morality, and the episode's self-referential, almost clinical style posed a risk NBC simply couldn't justify. In a world where ratings ruled and advertisers demanded stability, the network chose to protect its position rather than take a gamble on a single, albeit daring, story. This conflict highlighted a deeper tension between creators and networks, one that still exists today. De Palma represented a new wave of filmmakers pushing the envelope, while NBC embodied a television industry built on predictability and mass appeal. The rejection of his Columbo script wasn't personal, it was systemic. It showed the limits of experimentation within broadcast TV at the time and illustrated just how tightly networks policed tone, content, and audience expectations. Ultimately, NBC's refusal to move forward wasn't a rejection of art, but a reflection of how little room there was for risk in the world of commercial television. The homicide that filmed itself. In Brian De Palma's unproduced Columbo episode, the homicide wasn't just committed. It was recorded, edited, and transformed into a film within the story. The Slayer, a filmmaker named Quentin Lee, didn't simply want to get away with homicide, he wanted to turn it into a meta-narrative. His crime was part of a larger artistic project, a documentary chronicling not only the slaying, but also the investigation that followed. Cameras were everywhere, and Lee used them not just to capture evidence, but to shape reality. For the first time in the series, Columbo was not just the hunter, he was the subject, a character being observed and manipulated by forces he didn't even know existed. This created a rare inversion of Columbo's structure. Typically, the detective watches others. He notices the smudged glass, the oddly timed phone call, the offhand comment that gives a slayer away. But in this version, Columbo was the one being watched. 3 film students follow him with handheld cameras, supposedly documenting his investigative method, but in truth, serving the slayer's narrative. The audience, instead of watching Columbo unravel the mystery, watches him being drawn into a performance orchestrated by the slain. It turned the episode into a layered commentary on authorship, manipulation, and perception, where even the viewer's perspective is no longer trustworthy. This meta-construction placed the episode decades ahead of its time. Long before reality television, found footage horror, or Netflix docuseries turned real people into dramatic content, De Palma imagined a world where the line between truth and performance was deliberately obscured. Quentin Lee's camera didn't just record events. It created meaning, shaped public perception, and controlled narrative authority. The fact that Columbo, the moral center of the show, was co-opted into that narrative added a chilling undertone. Even truth seekers can be edited, reframed, and stripped of their power when caught in someone else's lens. At its core, the script served as a prescient critique of voyeurism. It questioned the ethics of watching, who is being watched, why, and for whose benefit. In this version of Columbo, the viewer is implicated in the spectacle. Are we rooting for justice, or just entertained by the hunt? That tension, subtle in most episodes of the show, becomes explicit here. The detective is reduced to content. The crime becomes commentary. In burying the episode, NBC wasn't just rejecting a dark story. They were rejecting a reflection of the medium itself. Quentin Lee, anti-villain. Quentin Lee, the central antagonist in Brian De Palma's Lost Columbo script, stood in stark contrast to the show's traditional lineup of slayers. Most Columbo villains were wealthy professionals, surgeons, executives, actors, who were slain to protect their reputations, fortunes, or egos. They were self-interested, calculating, and usually undone by a single overlooked detail. But Quentin Lee broke that mold entirely. He wasn't driven by passion, profit, or self-preservation. He slays to make a statement, an artistic experiment wrapped in a calculated performance. For him, the act of homicide was not a means to an end, but the end itself. This made him the show's first true anti-villain. While other slayers concealed their crimes with emotional panic or moral justification, Lee openly embraced his role as both director and destroyer. His choice of victim was arbitrary, selected by throwing a dart at a list of public figures he considered inauthentic. In his eyes, the person he slayed was not even fully real, just a public zircon, a fake gem, undeserving of existence. His detachment wasn't sociopathy in the clinical sense. It was philosophical. He saw death not as tragedy, but as commentary, a way to critique a media-obsessed culture by participating in its darkest spectacle. Quentin Lee's character echoed real-life provocateurs like Truman Capote, who blurred the line between documenting crime and dramatizing it, and Andy Warhol, who found art in repetition, fame, and cold detachment. Like them, Lee turned the lens outward and inward simultaneously, filming the slaying, the aftermath, and even Columbo himself, all to construct a meta-narrative about observation and control. He didn't fear being caught because, in his mind, the crime had already succeeded the moment it was captured on film. Justice, guilt, even morality. These were just outdated narratives to him, easily edited out of the final cut. In this way, Lee served as both a mirror and a warning. He exposed the voyeurism inherent in both media and audience, daring viewers to consider whether they were watching to see justice served or simply to be entertained. By slaying without cause, he disrupted the moral economy that Columbo was built on. He wasn't just a slayer, he was a philosophical grenade tossed into the middle of a procedural drama. And in a way, NBC's decision to bury the episode confirmed his thesis that some truths are too uncomfortable to air, and that spectacle, when stripped of purpose, can still hold terrifying power. The collapse of structure. At the heart of Columbo's enduring appeal is its rock-solid structure, a framework that subverts the typical whodunit by showing the slayer at the start and then focusing the tension on how the detective will expose them. This inversion only works because the show carefully builds emotional stakes, psychological nuance, and logical progression. Every Columbo episode hinges on motive, a financial inheritance, a bruised ego, a desperate cover-up. The audience knows the what and the who, but the why gives the story weight. In Brian De Palma's discarded script, this essential pillar was removed. The slayer had no motive. There was no emotional unraveling. The audience wasn't led through a trail of clever deductions because the slayer didn't care about being understood, and that broke the show's rhythm entirely. Rather than walking viewers step by step through a trap being set, the episode leaned into ambiguity and abstraction. Clues weren't rooted in behavioral inconsistencies or technical slip-ups. They were layered into a surreal meta-narrative involving cameras, performance, and perception. While that might make for an intriguing art film, it deflated the suspense that Columbo relies on. Instead of gradually tightening the noose, De Palma's version drifted, philosophical instead of procedural. Viewers wouldn't be following the detective's quiet brilliance. They'd be trapped in the slayer's self-referential performance, where nothing could be trusted and nothing truly resolved. This wasn't merely a matter of darker tone or experimental visuals. It was a full collapse of Columbo's narrative architecture. The show's structure is an engine, and every part of it, Columbo's humble persona, the slayer's arrogance, the carefully placed contradictions, is designed to make that engine run. De Palma's version removed the fuel. The episode replaced logical escalation with thematic exploration, and in doing so, severed the emotional contract the series had built with its viewers. It wasn't that the audience couldn't handle the content, it's that there was no longer a clear story to hang on to, no progression of cause and effect. Ultimately, the episode didn't just ignore the rules of Columbo, it dismantled them. And while that might sound brave from an artistic standpoint, it meant sacrificing the very mechanics that made the show work. Columbo's brilliance lies not just in his deductions, but in how those deductions lead to justice, restoring order in a world briefly tilted by slaying. Without that structure, the show becomes something else entirely, something less satisfying, less coherent, and far less Columbo. But even the boldest ideas can't survive when the clock's ticking and the budget's bleeding. And that's when reality pulled the plug. When reality got in the way. The shelving of Brian De Palma's Columbo episode wasn't solely a matter of creative discomfort. It was also the victim of brutal timing and production logistics. In the summer of 1973, Hollywood was reeling from a major writers' strike that had thrown schedules into chaos and left networks scrambling for content. Columbo, already a demanding production with feature-length episodes and complex staging, was hit particularly hard. De Palma's script, layered with meta-narrative, on-screen camera work, and ambitious visual setups, was simply too elaborate to execute under such strained conditions. What might have been possible under ideal circumstances became impossible when time and budget were running out. Adding to the strain was the backlog of episodes that needed to be delivered. The production team had to prioritize stories that could be shot quickly, on budget, and with minimal risk. Enter Double Exposure, a clever but more traditional Columbo script penned by Stephen Bochco. It featured a tech-savvy slayer who used subliminal messages to manipulate his victim. An inventive concept, but one that stayed well within the show's established structure. Crucially, it was faster to shoot and didn't require a fleet of film students trailing Columbo or a self-reflexive visual language. It was efficient, reliable, and manageable. Everything De Palma's script was not. The decision to go with double exposure wasn't necessarily a creative judgment, it was a logistical triage. Producers were making calls under pressure, with limited resources and tight deadlines. De Palma's episode might have impressed on paper, but it demanded time the show didn't have, both in pre-production planning and in execution. Sets would need to accommodate multiple diegetic cameras. Scenes would require complex staging to reflect the documentary within a show concept. And editing would be far more intricate than usual. All of this added up to a production risk NBC couldn't afford to take, especially with the strike still disrupting the industry. In the end, it wasn't the darkness or ambition of the script that slayed it, it was the calendar. Had De Palma submitted his pitch a season earlier or later, or under more flexible circumstances, it might have been greenlit. But television is a medium bound not only by creativity, but by schedules, budgets, and production windows. No matter how bold the concept, if the machine can't accommodate it, the idea gets left behind. De Palma's episode remains a ghost of what could have been, not just because of what it said, but because reality gave the show no time to say it. Salvaged fragments. Although Brian De Palma's Columbo episode was never filmed, its creative fingerprints can be found in surprising corners of the series' later seasons. While the original script was shelved, several of its most distinctive concepts quietly reappeared, repurposed in altered forms. Most notably, the idea of film students following Columbo, originally a meta-narrative device in De Palma's story, surfaced in the 1974 episode Mind Over Mayhem. There, a character named Steven Spielberg, a cheeky nod to the real Steven Spielberg, who had previously directed a Columbo episode, appears, hinting at the student filmmaker motif that was central to De Palma's version. Though the tone and stakes were diluted, the structural echo was unmistakable. The theme of surveillance, which De Palma treated as both a visual style and a philosophical layer, also began to surface more prominently in later episodes. In his unused script, surveillance wasn't just a tool, it was the Slayer's artistic medium, a way of controlling narrative and perception. Subsequent Columbo stories like Homicide, Smoke, and Shadows leaned into similar ground, featuring showbiz settings, manipulative camera work, and slayers obsessed with optics and image control. These later entries often featured characters who blurred the line between creator and criminal, echoing Quentin Lee's role as a deadly auteur shaping reality to fit his vision. Another lasting element was the erosion of narrative stability. De Palma's episodes sought to destabilize the viewer's experience, blurring the boundary between what was real, filmed, staged, or imagined. While later episodes didn't go as far, some began to incorporate dream sequences, surreal imagery, and exaggerated theatricality, signs that Columbo was becoming more self-aware and willing to play with form. Episodes like Homicide, a self-portrait, veered into symbolic territory, using visual metaphors and layered storytelling that nodded, perhaps unconsciously, to the conceptual risks De Palma once proposed. In this way, De Palma's lost episode lingers as a ghost in the show's creative DNA. Though never credited, its ideas were not entirely buried. They were scattered, softened, and absorbed into the evolving aesthetic of Columbo. The series never fully embraced the radicalism of that 1973 script, but it grew more theatrical, more introspective, and at times more visually daring in the years that followed. It's as if the buried episode whispered from behind the curtain, challenging the show to stretch a little further, without ever stepping fully into the darkness that once made NBC flinch. Showbiz Reflections. When Columbo returned after its original run ended in 1978, the revived episodes throughout the late 80s and 90s began to reflect a new sensibility, one that was far more theatrical, stylized, and at times self-mocking. Nowhere is this shift more visible than in the 1989 episode Homicide, Smoke, and Shadows, which featured a flamboyant young film director as the Slayer. Set almost entirely within the artificial world of a Hollywood backlot, the episode embraced and exaggerated every trope of the movie industry: stage lighting, camera tricks, studio egos, and cinematic one-liners. The Slayer didn't just plan a homicide, he staged it with the flair of a blockbuster director. Columbo, wandering through elaborate sets and smoke-filled scenes, was placed in a world that felt more like a satire of the entertainment industry than a grounded homicide investigation. The tone had shifted dramatically from the somber psychological realism of earlier seasons to something bordering on parody. This transformation wasn't limited to just one episode. As the revival continued, Columbo episodes grew increasingly enamored with spectacle. Stories like Columbo Goes to the Guillotine and Homicide, a self-portrait indulged in surrealism, flashy visuals, and exaggerated characters. The grounded settings of study rooms and offices were replaced with magic shows, dream sequences, and avant-garde art studios. Even Columbo himself seemed more like a character in a theatrical performance than a detective in a procedural. Scenes stretched out not for narrative necessity, but for dramatic or comedic effect, like a nearly 10-minute sequence of Columbo wobbling on a waterbed. The show, once subtle and cerebral, had begun to embrace absurdity in ways it never had during its original run. This shift in tone, while divisive among fans, inadvertently echoed the spirit of Brian De Palma's unaired Columbo episode, though not its substance. De Palma's script was cold, clinical, and metatextual, designed to disrupt narrative norms and challenge viewer comfort. The revival episodes did the opposite. They played to the crowd, exaggerating Columbo's quirks and surrounding him with increasingly outlandish settings. Yet the DNA of De Palma's vision still lingered. His unproduced script had placed Columbo inside a film being made about him, a story aware of its own construction. In a looser, more comedic way, the later episodes followed suit, often turning Columbo into a participant in artificial, performative worlds. These episodes didn't share De Palma's philosophical ambitions, but they embraced the same central idea, that storytelling itself could be part of the mystery. The irony is that NBC once rejected De Palma's episode for being too self-referential, too experimental, and too destabilizing to the show's formula. And yet, in the years that followed, Columbo gradually drifted into that very territory, though with a lighter tone and safer execution. The revived series turned increasingly toward Hollywood itself, using the industry as both setting and subject. Actors, directors, and publicists became frequent villains, and the homicide plots took on a cinematic flair. The series, once focused on exposing ego and vanity through quiet deduction, now flirted with becoming the kind of spectacle it once critiqued. In this evolution, the buried episode becomes a strange sort of prophecy, a creative boundary the show once refused to cross, but later approached with open arms and a wink to the camera. Columbo's moral code. One of the most enduring aspects of Columbo's appeal lies in its deep, almost old-fashioned moral architecture. While other detective shows relied on surprise twists or plot contrivances, Columbo thrived on psychological inevitability. Every episode was built around a flawed human motive: greed, jealousy, pride, fear. These were the emotional cracks that Lieutenant Columbo exploited, not with force or intimidation, but with patience and empathy. His quiet strength came from understanding the very human reasons why people committed terrible acts. In exposing these motives, Columbo didn't just solve crimes, he restored a kind of moral balance. Each case was not just a puzzle, but a character study that reaffirmed the idea that choices, even evil ones, are driven by relatable, comprehensible impulses. This delicate moral equation is exactly what would have been shattered by Brian De Palma's proposed episode. In that version, the Slayer didn't act out of desperation or wounded pride, but out of nihilistic curiosity, committing homicide not for gain, but as an artistic gesture. A Slayer without a motive, especially in a Columbo episode, is not just a narrative twist. It's a disruption of the show's entire ethical framework. Columbo's power as a detective doesn't come from brute logic alone. It comes from moral insight. He knows what makes people tick, and his cases are often about gently peeling back layers of self-deception until the truth is exposed. When the Slayer has no motive, there are no layers to peel, just an empty void, masquerading as meaning. Without motive, the emotional arc of a Columbo episode collapses. Typically, the audience watches a powerful figure unravel as Columbo closes in, not just legally, but morally. The moment when the Slayer finally breaks, when their composure slips and they realize they've underestimated the detective, is key to the show's payoff. That moment is built on guilt, on the idea that deep down the Slayer knows they were wrong. A character like Quentin Lee, who doesn't believe in right or wrong, robs the show of that final catharsis. There is no lesson, no humility, no justice, only performance. And Columbo, who acts as a kind of ethical mirror to each criminal, is left without a reflection. Columbo's charm is his contradiction, a disheveled man who brings order, a humble figure who sees through arrogance, a seemingly confused detective who uncovers deep psychological truths. He operates in a world where people's flaws can be understood and, in a way, forgiven until they cross a line. That moral clarity is what grounds the show and makes Columbo a uniquely powerful character. Introducing a Slayer who acts without motive, who slays for spectacle or theory, would have undercut everything the series stood for. It would have turned the detective from a moral equalizer into a passive observer of chaos. In that sense, De Palma's script didn't just challenge the show's formula. It threatened to remove the moral spine that held Columbo together. But if Columbo's moral compass was shaken, what would have happened if the episode had actually made it to air? The episode that could have changed everything. Imagine if Brian De Palma's Columbo episode had actually been produced and aired in 1973, a jarring departure from the show's reliable structure, with a Slayer who slayed not out of anger or ambition, but purely for the sake of creating an artistic spectacle. It would have marked a defining moment in the history of television, shattering not only the expectations of the Columbo audience, but also the boundaries of what episodic TV could attempt. The format, until then so dependent on narrative clarity and emotional catharsis, would have suddenly been confronted with philosophical ambiguity and existential dread. Viewers would have seen their beloved Lieutenant Columbo stripped of his usual psychological tools, investigating a man who wasn't hiding his guilt, but flaunting it for the camera. Whether the episode ended in an arrest or not, it would have left the audience questioning what justice even meant in a world where homicide could be framed as performance. Had it aired, the ripple effects might have gone far beyond a single episode. The show's tone could have gradually shifted toward darker, more psychologically complex storytelling, as creators became emboldened to experiment further with narrative form and emotional discomfort. De Palma's script might have opened the door for other auteurs and risk-takers to leave their imprint on the show, turning Columbo into a rotating platform for bold directorial visions, much like The Twilight Zone had done a decade earlier. On the flip side, the backlash could have been just as powerful. Audiences expecting comfort and closure might have rejected the deviation entirely, calling it pretentious, disturbing, or simply unwatchable. The network, stung by the reaction, could have walked back future creative risks, pushing the show to become even more formulaic as a result. It's even possible that Columbo, despite its critical acclaim and dedicated fan base, might have ended sooner had the episode aired and failed spectacularly. The show's charm rested heavily on the audience's trust in its rhythm, the slow unraveling, the humble persistence of the detective, the satisfying conclusion where order is restored. De Palma's take would have denied viewers that comfort, replacing it with a cynical meditation on performance, perception, and artistic cruelty. If met with confusion or disdain, NBC might have pulled back on its support of the series altogether. What was originally a clever reinvention of the crime genre might have been remembered as a cautionary tale of what happens when TV tries to think too much like film. And yet, the greatest irony is that this episode, one that could have altered the creative trajectory of Columbo, for better or worse, never had the chance to do either. Shelved due to timing, budget, and tonal concerns, it lives only in scattered production notes, second-hand accounts, and the faint shadows of ideas that resurfaced in later episodes. In the end, the episode that could have redefined Columbo became its greatest what if, a ghost story buried beneath decades of television history. It was a risk so bold that the industry never let it prove whether it was brilliant or disastrous. In a show where justice is always served and every question is eventually answered, it remains the one unsolved mystery. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of Columbo history, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. We want to hear your theories. What do you think would have happened if this episode aired? And don't stop now. Click the next video on your screen to dive deeper into more TV mysteries that almost never made it to air.